Hi, I'm Chip Rogers, and welcome to the Educational Experience. This week, we continue our series on regulations and how it's impacting your business, and we will specifically talk about Obamacare. Now, I know that used to be a term that you weren't allowed to say, at least on half of the aisle, but apparently the president's okay with it, so we'll be okay with it, and everybody knows what it means, so we'll use the term Obamacare. My guest again this week, and I thank them for joining us. To my direct left is Misty Challey, and she is with the Coalition. She's the executive director of the Coalition of Franchisee Associations, some of the biggest names in the franchise business, and we'll talk more about that later. To her left is Ben Domenech, and he is with the Heartland Institute, which is a libertarian think tank, and his specialty is working on healthcare policy. And I believe you're the editor of Healthcare News. Explain to us also, Ben, what is Healthcare News? I get Healthcare News. I read Healthcare News. People may think I'm a geek because I read it, but it is a great magazine. So tell us about it.
Healthcare News is our monthly publication that goes out to legislators primarily across the country, but also business owners and people who are engaged on these issues. It's essentially trying to give them a broad perspective on the healthcare news stories that are happening across the country in various states, and really highlight for them the important issues that they ought to be following. More and more in the past couple of years, as Washington has sort of taken over this area of policy, we've focused more on the national level stories, but really what we try to do is drill down to the important stories that everybody needs to know so that they can monitor the trends that are important to their business and to their livelihood.
Now, the reason that's important, I want to get a little in depth here on Obamacare, is because if you follow this historically, you go way back to World War II, and we had price controls, we had wage controls, and prior to that time, the notion of an employer or a business owner paying for their employees' health care was essentially unheard of. But government can never control economics. It can try, but it can't control the laws of economics. So as employers needed to compensate their employees more, what happened was they said, well, if I can't give you a raise, I'll just give you a benefit, and that's where healthcare came in. So over the last 50 to 60 years, the notion of an employer paying for your healthcare has become fairly commonplace. And that set up a terrible scenario where you have a third party paying an expense for you that we know in all human existence that typically doesn't work out very well. So over time, people began to say, healthcare costs are rising too much. That should have come to no one's surprise based on the system we set up. And then in the steps, many years ago, the Clinton administration, under what was then known as Hillary Care, and attempted to do this, was unsuccessful. And then Obama comes to office, and he is successful in doing this. Now, the famous words from Speaker Pelosi at the time was, we will know what's in the bill, we can read the bill, or we'll figure it out after it passes. Well, Ben, I know you have looked at the bill, and I'm not going to ask you to recite it.
Sure.
But from a small business owner's perspective, what is in this thing that you're not going to like?
Well, I'll tell you a number of things that I think would come to my concern, and you lay out, I think, a very good picture of how we got to this point. Really what's going on is, as you said, a subsidized third-party payer system where consumers, the people who actually consume care, and we're not talking about emergency room care, we're talking about the normal care that they would receive, which is actually the largest burden in terms of what makes up the costs of care, are completely insulated from how much something costs. If you think about it, you can go into any store in your area, you can compare products, you can say which one's more expensive, which refrigerator is going to get me more bang for my buck. Do I need this aspect of it, or do I need that aspect of it? Within healthcare, it's the one area within the marketplace where we don't have an existing marketplace, where the consumer has no power to essentially know how much something's going to cost before they order it, and be able to make a decision about which level they want to receive. Within essentially the broader perspective of this healthcare law, President Obama and his allies had a decision to make about how they were going to address this problem. They could have gone after the problem of cost, or they could go after the problem of coverage. They chose to go after the problem of coverage. They basically made the assumption, one that has been popular in some circles but is widely debunked among people who actually pay attention to the aspects of policy that we think are important, that if you just get more people into the system, that will have an effect in terms of the cost that the system is burdened with. They talk about the danger of free riders, of people who go into emergency rooms and access care without actually paying anything for it, and the cost that is borne by the government because of that. That actually turns out to be an extremely small amount of money. And in reality, the number of people who are clogging emergency rooms today are primarily subsidized by the government. They're from Medicaid and simply can't access a doctor. From the perspective of small businesses then, what they have to understand is the level of mandates that are within this law. One is an individual mandate to have insurance of a certain level for you and for your family. In terms of the requirement that you see within that, there are numerous income cutoffs in terms of the points where you can access subsidies, whether you can go into Medicaid or whether you can go into what is called a subsidized state exchange. Under Obamacare's approach, there are two exchanges that are actually set up, or that are supposed to be set up in every state. One is an exchange for individuals, where they would go in and buy their own policies subsidized by the government. The other is a small business exchange, where small businesses would go in and similarly buy subsidized policies. The decision that employers have to make essentially is whether they're going to decide to provide insurance at the levels that are required by the government. The number one thing to understand there is that the vast majority of small business plans, the vast majority of plans that are currently being offered to their employees, are not going to qualify. They are not going to meet the various essential thresholds that the government has put in place. What that means is, instead of providing your employees a plan that had catastrophic coverage plus an HSA, a health savings account where people could set aside money and use it for their various health purchases, which is the fastest growing portion of the marketplace and which is becoming extremely popular because typically people end up saving money, being able to keep more money, and having more flexibility to spend the money as they see fit. Plus they have the insurance of a catastrophic plan if they get hit by a bus or have something terrible happen to them. That's the program, that's the kind of approach that more and more people want. But the government is explicitly saying, we don't want you to buy that kind of plan anymore. We want you to buy essentially gold-plated coverage that covers everything stem to stern. And what we've seen is that not only makes for more expensive plans, but it makes for plans that give people fewer options in terms of the things that are available to them. And so the decision process that small businesses have to make is, do I want to I'm going to have to give up the coverage that I'm offering my employees anyway, because it's not going to be eligible for these enormous subsidies offered by the taxpayer. But I now have a decision to make. Do I not offer coverage and pay a fee to the federal government as a penalty for not offering that coverage, and then kick my employees then into this exchange to essentially buy as individuals? Or do I try to provide coverage knowing that the costs are only going to continue to go up and that in future years I may not be able to afford it anymore? That's a huge decision that now faces every small business, and frankly I don't envy it because I think it's a difficult one to make.
And Misty, on that point, I mean, if you're, for your members, they're looking at, when they look, they say, okay, I'd like to expand, and I want to hire 2 new people.
Right.
When you figure that out, you figure out the cost of hiring those 2 new people. It's not just wages, but it's all the
Exactly.
benefits that are associated with it. Well, now, under this new law, the cost is going to be more for each one of those people you hire. So the cost of an employee is more. Therefore, you're probably less likely to hire more employees.
Exactly.
We've got about a minute left in this segment.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just to follow on to that point, a lot of franchisees are providing insurance for their managers, and a lot of those that have spent a lot of time in there, are dedicated to the franchise and to the owner. What's going to happen, as was mentioned, is that those plans are no longer are going to go sky high. They may not comply with whatever regulations come out about what minimum essential coverage is, and they're going to drop insurance completely. So now, not only are you not providing for your managers, you're not providing for anybody. So it really has the reverse effect on that. And that's a huge problem. And every franchisee I meet is preparing for 2014, saying, I'm going to keep my numbers so I do not meet that 50 threshold. If that means keeping everybody part-time, then that's what I'm going to do. So what you're going to find is a lot of part-time people now going from full-time to part-time right at that 30-hour threshold, which is the definition of what full-time is, and now they're going to have to get 2 jobs to be able to pay to cover their household expenses, and they're going to have 0 insurance. So now you've got full-time with insurance to 2 part-time jobs with no insurance, and it's just created kind of a nightmare.
Only the government could have accomplished
Exactly.
this. We've got to take a quick time out. When we come back, I want to talk about this word we hear tossed around a lot called exchanges. And you guys explain to us what that means and why, as a small business owner, you need to be concerned with it. We'll take a quick time out and be back right after this. Welcome back to the Educational Experience. I'm Chip Rogers, and again, my guest this week, Misty Challey, who is the Executive Director of the Coalition of Franchisee Associations, and Ben Dominich, who is with the Heartland Institute. Now, guys, this term we have heard the last few years, and it used to actually be a good term, I think, many years ago. It's called healthcare exchange. Now it's part of what we call Obamacare, affectionately. And tell us we'll start with you, Ben. What is a healthcare exchange, and what is the difference between the healthcare exchange that is in the law and what maybe somebody had heard of 6-7 years ago, which was called a free market healthcare exchange?
Sure. Well, originally exchanges were built on the idea that were created around the idea that there's too much that is misunderstood about the insurance market. The insurance market, as you noted before, was never really built to be available to individuals. It was built to be something that was, over time, that was really beholden to the employer because of the quirk we have in our tax code where employers are eligible for essentially a tax subsidy for providing their employees care, but individuals are not eligible for that. So people who buy within the individual market don't have that tax subsidy available to them. The exchange was created originally, or the idea of it, to give both small businesses and individuals the flexibility to sort of go into a marketplace that would resemble something like Orbitz or Travelocity, where they would be able to compare different plans and make a determination about which one was right for them and for their families. This, as an idea, is not necessarily a bad thing. You can look at Utah, where they have a small business only exchange. It's fairly small, but there's no market warping subsidies that are available through this exchange. It's simply a way for people to make a determination about which plan is right for them and for their employees. That's not really anything that's particularly bad. The Utah Exchange has fewer than 10 employees who work for the government. It's very inexpensive to run. It's essentially just a web portal. The difference between that and what Obamacare creates across the country is significant, and it really is so significant to the point that you should have to preface it by saying it's an Obamacare exchange, because it really is not the same thing. According to these exchanges, the plans that are sold within that exchange are going to be regulated really directly from Washington, which means that even if your state sets up an exchange and the feds don't, as some states have pursued that, but the vast majority of states have held back and not implemented exchanges yet, the feds actually have the final say on everything that's available in that exchange in terms of the plans that are provided, in terms of the various things that they have to cover. So for instance, within certain states across the country, some legislators had the idea, well, I'm happy to implement an exchange because my small business community thinks that it would be good for us to do it, but we also don't want to, for instance, subsidize abortion or subsidize certain other things that are available through that exchange. The final say for that exists in Washington at the Secretary of Health and Human Services, whoever that may be, which means that should Kathleen Sebelius at a whim say this is essential to your plans, every insurer who wants to sell a plan through that exchange will have to cover that element. What that really comes down to is an ability on the part of Washington to take over every single state's insurance market, to determine what coverage they have to provide, and to decide essentially what is available within that marketplace. And what's more, they make available these enormous market warping subsidies, which enable people to go into these exchanges and frankly make it desirable on the part of some employees, particularly employees with families, to be dropped by their employer from having coverage so that they can qualify for these taxpayer subsidies, which are oftentimes much more generous than what they would have received from their employer. It's a very difficult situation to look at and say there is anything going on with these exchanges other than a direct market takeover from Washington of the insurance marketplace across the country, under the guise of something that had previously been very benign.
I want to follow up on that, Misty, from the individual employer standpoint, because most employers recognize to be competitive in the marketplace of attracting good employees, they've got to offer health care because it's generally accepted as that's part of your employment package.
Right.
Some employers can't afford what we would refer to as the gold plate or the Cadillac insurance.
Exactly.
And in certain states, and I know in our state and many states, this has long been a battle of, do you have health care policies that are available to employers to offer that don't have all these extra things that you may not need?
Right.
As Ben points out, under the exchange model though, even the worst plan is probably going to be one of these gold-plated plans.
Exactly.
And now an employer looks at it and says, hey, if I could offer, the catastrophic coverage with the HSA, I'd love to do that for my
Right,
employees,
right.
but I cannot afford this big one.
Exactly, and there are a lot of regulations that have yet to be issued regarding the employer mandate. But we do know two things. One, that the employers have to provide what's called minimal essential coverage, which all they have defined about that is that the coverage has to have a 60% actuarial rate or cover 60% of the costs incurred. That's number one. Number two, that the employer has to provide a plan that is affordable for their employees, and this is what is causing a lot of concern on behalf of employers, because what is defined as affordable is the employee cannot pay more than 9.5% of their income for the plan. So, and actually what the law says is it's the household income. What the guidance is saying is, okay, how is an employer going to find out the cost of everybody in that household's income? Again, a huge burden on employers. And so what the guidance is saying is, okay, well, let's just look at the individual employee's income. Okay, well, you're looking at 9.5% of your individual employee's income. Well, it has to be basically your lowest paid individual employee because, in order to comply with everybody you're providing that insurance for, you have to kind of go with the lowest number to make sure you're in full compliance, or else you're paying a $2,000 per employee penalty. And this is the plan that's being referred to. I mean, this is simply unaffordable. And when it comes to franchisees whose profits are very slim, very thin, their profits per each employer are actually lower in many cases than that $2,000 fine. So let's say they're making $1,300 profit per each one of their employee. Well, if they're not providing this gold-plated plan, they're paying $2,000 for not providing it, and they're out of business automatically and have to shut their doors. So they're not able to pay for those kind of catastrophic plans that actually do provide at least some coverage for really the most dire situations. And honestly, a lot of the employees want those plans, but they can't even choose to have them at this point. So it's either that or they're going to close their doors, and this is the situation we're facing now in Washington, and trying to explain to members of Congress that this is what the law is doing.
We've got about 2 minutes left. I want you to follow up on her comments a little bit.
I think that there's a number of points that you raised there that I think should concern anybody who's trying to compete within this marketplace. But here's one in particular that I think is troublesome. When you talk about franchisees and you talk about the employees that you currently have, most of the time you're going to be talking about people who are younger, people who do not have significant health care problems that have built up. The vast majority of them don't have any particularly expensive chronic conditions. So why should we require them to get these enormous gold-plated policies? And the reality is that it's not about them. It's about them subsidizing other people who are within this marketplace. It's about the fact that from the perspective of Washington, from the perspective of the president, there are insufficient young people, young healthy people who are buying insurance now, who they want to force to buy insurance so that they can subsidize other people who are in the pool. Here's why that doesn't work. Here's why that still breaks down. If you look at this from the perspective of the employee who is trying to make a determination about whether they're going to abide by the individual mandate or not, for example, for a family of four, let's say, making $25,000 or $26,000 a year, living in Georgia, say today, the maximum that they can be penalized under law for failing to purchase insurance for themselves is a little bit more than $2,000 a year. From their perspective, if they're evaluating the marketplace, they're simply not going to be able to find family coverage of the level that's going to qualify anymore from under this new Washington regime that will meet all of the different steps and that will qualify for these subsidies. So in reality, they're much better off just paying that fine, paying that penalty, moving on, taking the risk, and showing up at the emergency room when they have a problem and saying, sign me up for insurance, because now insurers are required to cover them no matter what their condition. I think that in terms of the small business calculations that are going to have to be made, similar requirements are going to be put in place, and I think you will, as she said, see tons of small businesses moving people to part-time so that they don't meet the threshold of having to provide them coverage, and seeing more and more small businesses trying to work their way around this through the various loopholes so that they can make actual money and keep their doors open. Otherwise, they'll be throwing everybody out on the street.
And that small family that you referenced, when faced with pay a $2,000 fine, if there was a real marketplace out there, potentially they could buy $3,000 a year catastrophic coverage and have some coverage, and most of them would probably opt to do that.
Exactly.
But now the government says you can't do that.
Right.
All right, well, we can't go any longer because we're out of time. Make sure to join us next week. We're going to wrap up this series on regulations, Obamacare, and maybe some of the things that can be done to help fix this problem. For my guest, who is Ben Dominich, thank you for being with us, and Misty Challey. I'm Chip Rogers. If you'd like to contact me, you can email me, chip@AAHOA.com. That's chip@AAHOA.com. We'll see you again next week.